Hi, everyone. My name is Addie Morfoot. I am the lead documentary reporter with Variety. I'm here today with the team behind Henson Idea Man. For our blind and low vision attendees, I'm going to describe myself. I have blonde hair, black glasses. I'm wearing a black shirt, sitting in a kitchen with a wall of pictures behind me. I am going to now introduce Henson Idea Man director Ron Howard.
Hi, well, thank you for that. I'm also one of the producers of Henson Idea Man. In addition to being the director, I'm sitting in my office den in my house. I've got a black baseball cap. I've got a blue T-shirt and a gray sweatshirt with an M for master class, because I taught a master class once that you can get online if you want to. And behind me are memorabilia from my past, from as an actor or a director, props from movies that I've used, and things that make me smile when I'm look up from my and cause me to remember. Let's see. I'll pass that along to Justin Wilkes.
Hi, I'm Justin Wilkes. Privileged to be here. Thanks, Addie, for hosting this. I'm the president of Imagine Entertainment, and I'm also a producer on the film. I'm wearing a black T-shirt. I'm sitting in a hotel room in Napa Valley, though you can't really tell that, except there's mountains painted on the wall behind me. And I'll throw it to my producing partner and colleague, Sara Bernstein.
Hi, I'm Sara Bernstein. I'm president of Imagine Documentaries and one of the producers on Henson Idea Man. And I am with curly blonde hair, wearing glasses, with a black shirt in front of a bookcase. And I'll pass it to Margaret Bodde.
Hi, Margaret Bodde. I am one of the producers on Henson Idea Man. And I am sitting in, not my office, someone's office that is just jam-packed with archival materials and film reels and things like that. I'm wearing a blue jacket, a pink shirt, and I have, I guess, gray speckled black hair. It's a pleasure to be here.
And by the way, back to Ron Howard for one quick second. I forgot to mention that I used to have red hair. It's pretty gray now. I've still got a little red in my beard. So I do have a beard with some kind of gray underneath, and the glasses that I desperately need, or I wouldn't know where I even was.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. You just had your Cannes premiere, which I heard was amazing. I wanted to talk first about the origins of this documentary. I have to imagine that many people have wanted to make this documentary before. How did it land at Imagine?
I can start that. I think we all have a version of that story. Really have to give credit to Marjan Javadi at Disney and her entire Disney colleagues over there. But Marjan had tipped us off that Disney would love to do the Jim Henson story. They have a relationship with the Muppets. A lot of that IP lives within the Disney ecosystem. And over the years, it had been something that they had all talked about. The challenge was that the family, the four remaining kids of Jim, who all run the Henson Corporation, had no interest in making a documentary about their dad. Not because they didn't think it was worthy, mainly because they still had this very strong and deep personal connection to him, as you'd expect. And his passing was still such a huge moment for all of them. I think the idea of telling his story and doing it the right way was sort of paramount concern for them. And over the years, as you said, many people had knocked on the door at one point or another, and they just really weren't interested. Marjan sort of tipped us off. We ended up having a meeting, Sara, myself, Ron, and the kids, and they even made clear at the very beginning that they had no interest in doing a documentary, but they were just so excited to meet Ron that they decided to do the Zoom anyway. And then somewhere over the course of that Zoom, there was a little bit of, Ron Howard magic in the conversation, but by the end of it, they actually pitched us the idea of doing the doc. Would we be sort of honored? And they even said, and Ron, I know this embarrasses you a little bit, but they said that Ron really reminded them of their dad, the spirit of just how he's brought so many great stories to life and what he loves to celebrate through his filmmaking, and just his disposition reminded him of them. And they said, we'd love for you to do it, and the only conditions are we'll have no restrictions on the editorial, and we won't be producers. So with that, go with God, and do your best work.
Well, Ron, I have to ask, what did you say? What were these magic words that you
Well,
said to them?
I had only met Jim very briefly once, but George Lucas, who's I've always been very close to, was a very dear friend of Jim Henson. So in a way, I felt like I knew him a bit through George. We talked a little bit about that. I had done a little bit of reading before I met them, and I found their willingness to talk about their childhood and to talk about both their parents in a very mature, expressive way, with love, but also a real adult's sense of how marriages work and how they falter, and when personalities clash, what does that look like? And I also just related to Jim's, sort of ongoing quest, this sort of restless creativity, I think is a phrase that I use, that they really connected with, that I feel, but I think he had it, beyond anyone that I've ever known. And I don't just mean that as workaholism. It's something else. It's just this tremendous passion to express yourself through your creativity, whether that's drawing or writing or building the puppets or performing the puppets. He was very introverted. I relate to that, but he could really speak through his puppets, and not in a way that was a lecture, but in a way that was witty and funny, but still kind of holding up a mirror to ourselves. So I was making these observations, and as we were discussing it, and I too was really getting hooked into the idea of doing the movie, because I just felt that the family story was of real interest. It could be surprising to audiences, and that the kids were willing to share enough to bring that part of the story to life.
Well, the marriage was very interesting, and I was honestly surprised that the kids discussed it in so much detail. They were so candid about it. Sara and Margaret, what was it like working with his children? And did you convince them to be candid, or was it something they were willing to do right away? And as producers, was that a challenge to work with someone that was so close to Jim Henson?
Margaret, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think, they are all so accomplished. Each of them, Heather and Cheryl and Lisa and Brian, they're such accomplished people in their own rights. And they kind of lived this for so long that they were really, kind of right there, very present, during the interviews, very willing to talk about things. I mean, if anything, personally, I just felt, great responsibility. I think we all felt great responsibility to try to get it right, and to be honest and to be revealing about someone who is so familiar to everyone. Everyone feels like if you grew up with Sesame Street and the Muppets and Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, all the great work that Jim did, you feel like you kind of knew him, but he's not here to tell his story, unfortunately. So I think that the kids really stepped up, as did, of course, all the interview subjects, including Frank Oz, who was incredible in sharing his collaboration with Jim.
I would just add, this is Ron jumping in, I would just add to that I had another feeling. I felt like that they knew this was their opportunity to make sure that their mom was recognized as fundamental to the development of these characters that were so iconic, and creating the business opportunity that would become Muppets Inc. and lead to so much, even though ultimately that was also something that created the pressure that sort of romantically began to erode the marital relationship. And I think they kind of knew that to make sure that you understood about their mom, by the way, without denigrating their dad at all. And and there's one more thing I'd just like to add to it. But I think that they also knew they needed to tell the full story, because in a way, even though there's some sadness in the full story, and of course they would have loved them to stay together and forever, you know, every kid wants that. There's also another recognition here, which is they handled even that rather brilliantly. They, with a lot of dignity and a lot of intelligence, and that family loves each other. And there's even in the wake of some discord. And that's in and of itself as kind of as great an accomplishment as anything that they ever put on screen.
I wanted to talk, well, first of all, I hope that someone makes a film about Jane, because I thought she was so incredible in her own right. I'm waiting for that documentary. Next. But in terms of Frank Oz, I mean, he is a key interview subject in this film, and I'm wondering, did he take any convincing? And if he hadn't done it, would you have made the film? I mean, he's very integral part to the film. So just curious about that.
Sara, you want to jump in on that?
Well, you're right, Addie. I think Frank Oz was, I mean, so important to the process. And I think he really, you know, he seemed, and I think you feel it in our film, that he was really his closest collaborator. And in a way, sort of, you know, the legacy kind of lives on within Frank too. But I mean, I think he seemed very willing to participate. I think for all of us, and Ron, Justin, Margaret, I think we were just very nervous, obviously, you know, to show him sort of the film in the end, because, you know, I mean, he was so close to him. He obviously is a filmmaker, a brilliant filmmaker in his own right. And I think, as you see, like, I mean, most of his input perspectives are really sort of key, I think, to kind of unlocking sort of his creative process, I think, but also, you know, really kind of trying to understand Jim emotionally.
Yeah, and he was on board, you know, right away. I mean, I think you know, Ron, you know, has worked with Frank, knows him over the years, and he just was, you know, the idea that Ron was making the film was a big part of his just eagerness. And I think, like Ron said about, you know, the Henson family and the Henson kids, he wanted to tell this story because this is the first time, you know, there was really a substantial, you know, story about Jim Henson, the man and the artist. And so he was totally on board. You know, we're all pretty half glass full producer types, so it never occurred to me that he wouldn't do it. So, you know, we didn't really entertain that idea.
But I think what's also sort of wonderful is you see Frank Oz's origin story in this too, right? And I mean, I had no idea how young he was.
I didn't either. I had
Collaborating.
no idea. So young. But also I want, speaking of young, I mean, Jim Henson passed away when he was, I think, 53, very, very young. And he packed so much into a short life. Justin, did you and Marjan ever talk about making this a series? Because I mean, there's so much to say about him. I'm just curious.
No, it's interesting. We didn't really talk about it as a series. I think we always felt that doing sort of the quote unquote definitive film was the best way to honor his story. And it doesn't mean that there won't be other films about other aspects of his life, and there have been some great other documentaries, including Marilyn Agrello's the Sesame Street document that came out about 4 or 5 years ago. So I think there's more to his story that can be unpacked. But I think we felt like just the narrative structure of a feature length film really did give us that beginning, you know, middle and end that everybody was sort of looking for. And just to go back to the Frank of it all, I think by coming out and saying that from both the family and us and Disney, we're doing the definitive version of this. It encouraged people that hadn't historically talked about him publicly, talked about their feelings towards him. It gave them the opportunity to come to the table and say, okay, because this is going to be the one, we're going to talk about it. And you got the sense from Frank, and it's interesting because he actually talks about it in the film when one of their collaborators had passed at one point, one of the other puppeteers had passed, and Jim was never someone to sort of look back. I mean, he obviously was very close with the people he worked with as a family, but it was all about, I think there's a comment where he says, well, he's in a different place now. And it was just, let's keep going forward. And I think when Jim passed, so many people around him sort of had that same feeling that there's this tremendous loss, but we have to just keep going forward. We have to keep creating. We have a responsibility to the audience, whether it's Sesame Street or Muppets and so on. And so for Frank, and we all had this incredible moment in New York when we did screen the final film for him, and we're on pins and needles because he really was, even in some ways more so than the kids, he was so close to Jim, especially in that collaboration. Frank had an incredible emotional reaction to the film, and what he said to us, I'll keep private, but what we can say is that he really saw this as like a cathartic process, and it was kind of the first time that he got to reflect upon just how much Jim really meant to him. And just even for us all to play the smallest role in that, was just tremendous.
Wow, that's great. Well, I wanted to also ask about the archival footage. There was an extreme amount of it. That was great. I loved all the family footage. Was that all provided to you by the estate, or did you go and search for certain, more archival? Sorry.
A substantial amount of material came from the estate, and it was incredible because Karen Falk is the Henson archivist, and she has been working brilliantly over decades now, that to put together all of the early work, the home movies, the family photos, every appearance. It's a pretty comprehensive, really well maintained and still acquiring things, active archive. But that said, we were kind of telling the story in the most broad way possible, including his influence, and we knew that there was like a need for a global outreach for more materials. And we found a lot of collectors who maybe they hadn't reached out to for different reasons. And so, we got people's home movies, which was extraordinary. Home movies on set, behind the scenes footage, which was incredible, that had never been seen before, that are really revealing of the process. And that's really, I think, that's always the holy grail, right? Is you want to see how things come together, and get kind of inside that process. So the archive was all kind of, we were to the last minute really searching for everything we could find around the world.
Well, getting back to Jane, that was the huge challenge because she didn't like to be interviewed. I mean, Jim was a reluctant interviewer. She pretty much avoided it. And and yet we knew we kept wanting to bring more and more specificity and clarity to their relationship and to that story. And we kept finding things. They were digging things out of the archives. Lisa Henson, found some photos that she took in high school that she never really even given to the archives. And several of those, were very, very useful. So that it was interesting. And I found this in working, in documentaries this last decade, as much as I have, is it's just fascinating how the sort of the process of gathering doesn't really end. I mean, we were still plugging in shots while we were mixing because we found a new shot, we found a new something, and found a way to use it. So that was always exciting. But the other thing that really hooked me on wanting to direct the movie was seeing the archives that the family did sort of expose us to as almost just a teaser, but it was an hour and a half or 2 hours of hilarity and creativity, whether that was his home movies or the experimental films or the early commercials that he was making. And And I didn't know that he had directed all of those little short films from Sesame Street, the numbers and the letters and things like that. But it was described that, well, he was using the same aesthetic to sell learning to kids in a kind of a, you know, a funny, witty way. And in fact, he stopped making commercials at that point. But you can actually see the origin story for that sensibility and that aesthetic as he's using puppets in those early black and white crazy little skits and 6-7 second commercials that are funny. So it was I was so knocked out by the range of the creativity, and also just the humor. It's also kind of a history of television through those eras, because you know you see how raw that early experimental TV was, and it kind of reminded me of what content creators do today using tech, using what's the latest. Is it TikTok? Is it something else? You know, how do I get noticed? How do I find my voice? Well, Jim and Jane were doing the same thing, using what was the cool new tech to them. That was TV.
Yeah. Yeah, that I didn't think of that. Wow. Well, I wanted to talk about the experimental film part of his career. Most people know him as the creator of the Muppets, and you could have just focused on the Muppets if you wanted to, but you decided to include his experimental films, and one including his 1965 Oscar-nominated Timepiece. Why was it important to you, Ron, to make sure that the experimental film part of his career was included in this documentary?
Well, it was such a surprise to me, and I went into the process with, you know, a lot of reverence and respect for Jim Henson, but it was exciting to see all the experimentation, you know, much of it not known, which means, you know, it didn't take off at that time. It didn't necessarily become, you know, he did experimental TV shows that I'd never heard of. You know, you got a budget, you got to make them, but you know, those are not the ones that clicked. Yet you can see a direct connection between those experiments and the work that we do revere and that we do, you know a lot about, and the work that's iconic for us. So that was interesting. I think maybe it was Cheryl. I can't remember which of the kids says it, and it's in the documentary. If you want to understand our dad, just see his short film Timepiece. And it says so much because it's funny, it's visual, it's energetic, but there's underneath it a desperation. He's racing against time. And it's so incredibly revealing that it really informed the aesthetic of our documentary too.
In what what do you mean by that?
Well, stop motion and the kinetic animations, and you know, a lot of that's Jim's, and some of it we've sort of created, and the sort of the syncopated, percussive heavy soundtrack, and again that sense of humor, the use of clocks going all the time. You know, all those things found their way into little bits that we did, kind of getting in and out of sequences, whether it's an animation about making the first time when Kermit was created by cutting up his mother's green coat, or the way Ralph was made by cutting a basketball in half and putting some fur on it, some eyeballs, and other things. So I found it really inspiring, and it was fun for me, and I learned something, kind of channeling Jim in a way through the making of the doc.
Sorry,
Ron gave a note to the team early on that the film should feel as if Jim had a hand in making it. You know, that I think really did infuse the editorial style, the graphic style, the music, certainly. Just that it does, you know, not that it's being told from Jim's perspective, but that it just felt like Jim had a hand in the creating of it.
Okay.
There was two other things I wanted to point out about the experimental film aspect, is that, you know, Jim made this experimental show for television called The Cube, right? And that was this kind of Twilight Zone kind of story. And one of the things that early on, Ron and Justin and Sarah, we were just, this idea of creating this space for the interviews where, things could be projected. It was kind of like a blank slate to some degree, but it also, keyed into, again, a stylistic nod to Jim with this, this idea of this, making reference to one of his experimental works and using it to create kind of a motif in the film where, people are, you're not distracted by, if we had filmed them in their homes or something like that. It's kind of like this space that's kind of in the Jim world. And the other thing is with experimental film, it's like, Jim is coming out of, the late 50s, early 60s. He was very much aware, I'm sure, of like the films of Stan Brakhage. And, his films are really so free. And you see it in the child, the kind of family films that he was making at home with his children, with like the backwards films. I mean, those are in the experimental tradition, and using film as this medium in which you can play with time and stop it and start it and make it go backwards. So the experimental aspect to me is really key in the film.
The film also brings up his feature films, one of which was The Labyrinth. I had forgotten about that movie until I watched the doc. I wanted to ask you again, his feature films, I don't know I don't think they did exactly well at the time, but do you think that they hold up? I think you said that they hold up now. Is that why you decided to bring that aspect of his career into the film?
Well, yes, and also because there is a interesting sort of I don't know, dichotomy there in that he worked so hard. Dark Crystal was successful, but not a huge hit. Labyrinth was really beaten up by the critics at the time and performed poorly and was a real heartbreak for him. And yet it is revered today as a really great work of fantasy from that era. As Jennifer Connelly says, when we interviewed her, the people want to talk to her more about that movie than anything else she's done since then, which causes me to wince because I directed her in Beautiful Mind and she won an Oscar. Yet, but so be it. So I love the fact that there's another lesson in this, which is this ongoing quest to make things, to work, to experiment, to be bold. It may not pay dividends immediately, but it's really what having a creative life is all about. And he embodied that. And so I certainly wanted to recognize that, but also, again, this is not just all celebration. It's a kind of it's a chance to understand a creative journey, a couple of creative journeys. And so, it was, that was important to me. But how did you guys feel about the movie?
Well, I think it's also he had this insatiable desire to create, right? He starts off at a local news station in DC with essentially sock puppets doing interstitials, and then he parlays that into commercials, then he parlays that into the Muppet Show. Sesame Street. After his first season of Sesame Street, it's the biggest show in the world. He's already ready to go do the next thing. He's already frustrated with just doing that. So he's always on to the next one. He does the Muppet Show and he ends it. It's the most successful show in the world at that point. He ends the Muppet Show because he wants to make movies, which goes back to what he originally wanted to do, which was to be a film director, be an independent film director. So we had to include the movies because it really was the completion of his journey. But then while he's making the movies, he's thinking about what's the Broadway show going to be? What's the series of experiential nightclubs that I'm going to create? Like he just kept going and going. And in that red book, which you see in the movie too, it was just flowing with ideas, people he meets, places he's going to, ideas for things that never manifested itself. There's also a line in the movie which I love. It's a passing mention, but it's in relationship to his feature films. He was doing world building before people used the term world building. Now, granted, Lucas had done that with Star Wars, but that was maybe the only example at the time. In Dark Crystal, he builds a completely new world with new characters speaking a new language. I think at one point, this E.T. comes out that same year. E.T. has one fictitious character, Muppety kind of character, and that's E.T. Everything in Dark Crystal was realized by Jim, and his team. So just to have that kind of creativity and frankly chutzpah to be able to just do that, even though it wasn't a financial success at the time, I think it's now gone on to be one of the most profitable titles that the Henson company has, because I think people do really appreciate that.
I also really, I mean, just even building on what Ron was saying, just about sort of the full creative journey. I think, yes, like you see sort of some of the struggles and kind of pivoting to films that Jim had, but what I always find remarkable is that incredible pitch video for the Muppet Show that he creates. And this idea that even with all of his success with Sesame Street, he can't find a buyer for the Muppet Show. And I think us, all of us as creatives or creative producers can totally relate to, just that kind of tenacity, but also, obviously that disappointment when someone doesn't want what you have and it's going to be brilliant. So the fact that even Jim Henson had to go through those hoops is really quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And he was always, I mean, that's one of the things that, Lisa talks about in the film. As a child, at the youngest, in the youngest years of his life, he's always drawing, he's always creating doodles and characters. And, this is throughout his life. He always had like a sketchbook and a notebook, and he was always creating. And, when he gets to University of Maryland and, is in the home economics program and meets Jane and, he's already been working. He's already been working in television, and he's already been doing, like when he gets to University of Maryland, he's designing beautiful posters for different campus events. He's just an artist, and it comes out throughout his life in different iterations. So to kind of, we include sketches from when he's a child all the way through the work that he was creating with 3D and CGI, before he passed.
If I had 1 ounce of his creativity, I'd feel good about, really good about myself. But I have time for one last question, which is, I'm wondering, if you're hoping that the younger generation watches this film and goes back and watches his earlier work, and what are you hoping that they take away from this documentary?
Well, sure, it'd be great for them to go back and revisit. I specifically recommend the Muppet Show episodes. They're just, they're remarkable gems. They're short, they're hilarious, and they really, really hold up. But yeah, of course, but to me, it's more about the excitement of creativity and discovering that creativity within yourself and nurturing it, and committing to it. And that there's fun to be had there. You don't have to be a tortured artist to be an artist. You can be in that sandbox because that's where you want to play and think and make things with other people and collaborate. And so I really hope it's the spirit of Jane and Jim, and the idea that you can, from nothing, you can make something that will really affect people, and they'll remember, and it'll put a smile on their face or make them think. So I hope that it fuels that and inspires that kind of creative excitement for audiences young and old.
Anyone else? All right. I guess that's a good place to end it. Thank you, Ron, Justin, Sarah, and Margaret for attending today. And thank you to our audience for joining us. All right.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Addie.
Thank
Thanks.
you.